In the halls of the city palace, half the world lies. Such words describe Wilhelm Friedrich, King of Prussia, who to all but the most nostalgic onlookers commands the most eminent power in Europe, if not the world. Modernity has come with abiding force, embraced by the king who remained constant in a time where all of his old contemporaries have faded. Prussia lies at the border of old and new, a kingdom of a time now gone, brought to the present through unyielding will. Few would truly deny Prussia's preeminence, not even the French inheritors of the old world order. Still, a question remains in the heart of the king and in the internal memos of Jerusalem alike, whether that balance can be maintained, or that the face of change will forcibly drag that border with it. But despite a generation which knows no other world, Prussia's place in the sun was far from a certainty. In the shadow of the 7 Years' War, only one nation seemed ascendant. France had vanquished their eternal enemy, secured its empire, and prepared for a world that trembled at Paris's gaze. What few at the time realized was how shallow this victory truly was. Despite Prussia standing firmly on the losing side, it would not share Britain's fate. France's strategy of victory necessitated a betrayal, abandoning their allies on the continent to focus entirely on Britain. This left Prussia still outnumbered, with increasingly weaker enemies. The Ottoman invasion of Russia collapsed the Eastern Front, and with that, the tide of war had changed. Though France's allies won globally, the European theater turned into a duel between Prussia and Austria, a duel which Prussia decisively won. Prussia stood locally victorious, with Frederick the Great only limiting his ambitions by that which France would overlook. This, as it turned out, was extreme, the French turning a blind eye as Prussian troops marched into Saxony and turned it into a puppet kingdom. Prussia had in a stroke come to dominate Central Europe, and France believed itself too powerful to even be concerned. And so it was, that in the shadow of French hubris, the future of Europe would slowly rise. What followed was a period of relative peace. Frederick refrained from further expansion to the west, instead of seeking to consolidate the new territories he'd acquired. The military victories had to be translated into political and economic ones as well, something made possible in the truly unprecedented times that had emerged. Prussia was essentially devoid of true rivals, with the Russians seemingly getting weaker with the passage of time, the Austrians fracturing inwards, and the French only caring that Prussia nominally acknowledged their supremacy. A golden age emerged, where the limit of Prussia's reach only seemed to be the ambition that it possessed. Though this time was short-lived and illusory, it gave the blueprint for that which was to come. And it was during this time, in 1773, that Wilhelm Friedrich was born. Nothing good can last forever, and like the North Sea which lies so close, the difference between calm waters and a raging storm is simply time and place. Frederick the Great's reforms brought Prussia out of the age of absolutism, and the Enlightenment to its doorstep. Enlightened, however, is not how one can describe the French world order. Gradually, Frederick withdrew from the world, isolating himself as his health and mental state declined. The young Wilhelm Friedrich, however, born far from the line of succession, was afforded relative peace. From the city limits of Berlin, the world was endless. Images of China, India, Persia, and above all, the paradoxically new and old Ikaria created a film to contrast the reality around. As the rain poured down in the old palace, he wondered to himself why the world was divided as it was, and whether one day the pieces could be put together. Perhaps a diplomat in a different reality, the tides of time would have a different vision in mind. As the new reforms grew old and the world became increasingly bleak, a sense of stagnation set in. The personalist rule of Frederick the Great brought glory, but it also created a central point around which the system revolved. Disillusioned and tired, Frederick withdrew further from public life, maintaining only close company he trusted in his love of art. Without direct heirs, the crown would pass to Frederick William II, a prince who with his entourage of nobles was more than happy to rest on the laurels of yesterday. With only a surface-level understanding of the national reforms and a tendency for reaction, it seemed that Prussia too would slowly shift into the international model that France had brought into force. Though not overtly hostile to reform, Frederick William had little interest himself. The reforms would remain, but no new ones would be passed, stagnating further as the nobility gathered more and more control. Still, Prussia remained unique. It maintained one of the most advanced and powerful militaries in the world, and without direct opposition, was free to pursue almost any policy it saw fit. Potential remained limitless, and while the kingdom lay dormant, it wouldn't remain so for long. Looking through a window, Wilhelm Friedrich imagined a vague vision, an image of greatness with only its outlines visible. Though outwardly satisfied, the flame began to grow, feeling an ambition yet to solidify but present nonetheless. He didn't know what he'd do that day, no plans or events. He sat on the fine couches and looked at all the vapid surroundings. Ornate portraits, golden lining, all seemed cheap compared to what lay outside. He'd find something to do, whatever it may be, whether it was planned or not. Ultimately, time beat him to the punch, and whether the outlines were visible yet, they would soon be made very clear. In 1788, in the middle of March, the king and his eldest sons died in a shocking accident. The news came very quickly, that the next in line to the throne was him. The coronation was near immediate, every faction with their own opinion, but all with a determination they would not let the young king rule on his own. Dozens of ministers and noblemen descended to ensure that the king's best interests were guaranteed, of course along with their own. In a split second, the world around him had shifted entirely, granted absolute power by coincidence, and surrounded by those who wished to wield it. The noblemen were the first obstacle of his reign. Though they were weakened under Frederick the Great, they had slowly been rebuilding their prominence. And with the young king, they saw an opportunity to turn back the clock and reassert their control. None of course would say this directly, and what ensued was a campaign of manipulation and sabotage that surrounded every aspect of his life. Nobody could be trusted, and even those he had known for years soon turned their backs on him with power in their eyes. It was in this state he was approached by the Duke of Mecklenburg, a longtime family friend and one of the few people he felt he could trust. One of his first moves was decrying the Duke of Stettin, one of the nobles most brazen in their attempted profiteering, and one who the king quickly grew to despise. Mecklenburg quickly had him removed from the Privy Council, a move which the king would have certainly agreed with, but a decision he disconcertingly made without the king's pre-approval. The Duke explained that this was due to the urgency of the matter, an explanation the king wearily accepted. Still, though he appreciated the Duke for his aid, he increasingly felt like a prisoner of the palace. Accepting a list of Mecklenburg's advisors, the king now had to deal with another entity, the military. Wilhelm Friedrich intimately understood how central this institution was, and feeling surrounded on all other sides, sought to influence its policy himself. He arrived at a meeting with Prussia's highest staff, most old veterans of Frederick the Great's wars nearly 20 years ago. The king intended to impress upon them a vision of reform, but was instead met with coldness and poorly hid contempt. The generals were entrenched and uncaring, believing themselves primarily responsible for Prussia's vast success, scarcely wanting to listen to someone decades their junior. With the army, the king found the inverse of the nobility. While the nobles attempted flattery as the path towards power, the army wished to stay exactly where they were. They were, however, effectively two sides of the same coin, representing the height of the nobility who had already been elevated to the most powerful positions in the land. In this sense, they were doubly dangerous, aristocrats with an ambition for power and the capacity to back it. The king's half-developed proposals went over poorly, with the king having no military background and the generals wanting to maintain their control. There was, however, one exception. Admiral Joseph Kraus of the much-neglected Prussian navy both agreed with the general ideas of the king and felt sympathy for his situation. He proposed an addendum to the king's plan, arguing that any reform in size and flexibility had to follow an increase in industry as well, and that such a development, though initially expensive, would allow for Prussia to ultimately have a capacity unmatched by any other power. Though Kraus was only explicitly talking about the navy, the king picked up on the wider suggestion at hand. Following the meeting, the king went directly to the admiral to express his admiration. This was highly unusual, but the admiral didn't mind, and responded with a thanks before saying, "It is always important to be surrounded by those you can trust and respect." It was the first time someone talked to the king directly, without ulterior motives or intrigues. This, however, was noticed by others as well. The Duke of Mecklenburg came to the king, explaining how the generals were displeased with the admiral's lack of regard for seniority. At this, the king cut him off, stating that he'd take no actions against the admiral. Mecklenburg simply said that he'd informed the generals of that decision. It was at that moment the king realized what was going on and decided that he'd let it go no farther. In another breach of protocol, he personally summoned the admiral to speak with him directly. The king explained how he felt trapped by the aristocrats around him, and how, as the admiral said, he needed to be with those he could trust and respect. The admiral responded quickly, not directly addressing the situation, but explaining that his position in the Naval Intelligence Service may be of use to the king. This was as thinly veiled as was shocking, using the Naval Intelligence Service to spy on those causing problems, nobles and politicians alike. The king immediately picked up on this suggestion and responded curtly, "I always have use for ingenious minds." The intelligence came back soon and was more shocking than the king could have imagined. He had begun to think that Mecklenburg was using him, but the reports soon revealed that his plotting was far worse. He had systematically eliminated all rivals to his influence and been meeting with various military leaders on the feasibility of establishing a governing council to assist the king in his rule. The king felt profoundly betrayed, but the pain of it quickly subsided into calculated planning. The king had vast amounts of dirt unearthed and was more than willing to use it. This, however, was unknown to Mecklenburg, who soon came in requesting to formalize his guidance and to create a special office to personally advise the king. The king, in a rapid turnaround, immediately denied such a request. Mecklenburg tried to speak but was interrupted and dismissed. Confused, he went to his manor only for it to dawn what had occurred. Nailed to his door was a note of extortion, listing all of his illicit activities, yet no direct demands. News soon reached him that the king had dissolved the Privy Council, as Mecklenburg frantically requested an audience with the king. The request was denied, and he went looking for the generals only to hear that they were all present at a meeting at the same time. The king was overcome by rage and wanted to purge all the generals who had betrayed him. The admiral, however, cautioned that if he went after both the military and the nobility directly, he may well lose control entirely. He reluctantly agreed, but was determined that his agenda would be put forward. He announced that the admiral's naval reforms would not only be implemented, but expanded to the rest of the army as well. A few generals spoke to protest, but the king then explained that a small reorganization would be necessary. He appointed Strauss Fischer, an old guard veteran unimplicated in the conspiracy, to be Lord General, and announced that the reforms in this decision were a royal decree and could not be argued. Upset and frustrated, the generals realized soon after leaving what had occurred. Although spared from the blackmail, they had heard what happened to their co-conspirators, and reasoned that they weren't immune either. Though hesitant, they reluctantly ceased their schemes, knowing that the present situation was the best they could achieve with the current circumstance. For the first time in months, the king had a moment to think. He had vague ideas of what he wanted, but no concrete plans. He felt himself standing on shaky foundations, staving off anxiety with a fierce determination lacking any real aims. He formed an early blueprint off of Vive Nazaria Vicria, telling the admiral that he is the world's first modern ruler. He was amazed at Icria's rapid development, how it seemed to evade all the predictions Europe levied at it. He wanted such modernity himself, and though challenged at first, gradually saw the vision manifest. August von Hardenberg and his ally Jum Stein had been using the chaos to advocate for their long-desired reforms. Above all, they wanted the abolition of serfdom and the reform of Prussia's courts. With the high nobility weakened, the king invited Hardenberg to the palace. Confused, Hardenberg arrived slightly worried, only to receive encouragement from the king and a suggestion to be more forceful. This began a long-lasting pattern, avoiding direct engagements in politics by acting through proxies. Unlike the king, Hardenberg could be criticized, which invited extreme opposition but pushed that opposition out of the shadows. Inversely, the king's proxy opinions could be openly debated, using politics as a public spectacle to covertly push the king's agenda. This was almost by accident at first, and when Hardenberg's speeches caused a march through Berlin, the king panicked and debated sending the police. The admiral, however, saw this strategy as a winning one, and pointed out how opposition that is vocal but controlled would be far easier to deal with. The admiral was right, and public politics, entirely new in the kingdom, soon became the foundation of royal control. The public was swayed and marched to the palace asking the king to adopt the reforms. He stood in the balcony, staring at the sky, and proclaimed it will be done. In front of cheering crowds, he saw his vision crystallize. The flame of ambition filled his eyes, hiding behind it all but the tiniest shred of fear. Time to think, however, would be rather short-lived. Hardenberg, now foreign minister, heard concerning news from the frontier. French troops had just marched into Austrian Belgium and expected Europe to obey. The king was relayed the news as opportunity seemed to present itself. Prussia would make its debut on the world stage, and would do so in force. Hardenberg arrived in Amsterdam, promising Prussian aid in exchange for trade concessions. The Dutch agreed, and their two armies met the French as a standoff ensued. Initially trying to occupy Liège, Prussia was outmaneuvered by France, shocking all the old generals as the armies lay precariously waiting. The Lord General, though losing the initiative, took direct command and made a semi-defensible position, preventing an outright withdrawal. The king began to panic, wondering if he overplayed his hand. Hardenberg, however, came back with an interesting piece of news. Mysterious delegates arrived from Britain, informing Prussia of a secret pact that would be mutually beneficial. Britain would take clandestine actions against France. If successful, Prussia would accept a British annexation of South Africa in exchange for a Dutch-controlled Belgium. The king agreed, on the caveat that the Netherlands would be, quote, free of undue influence. Later that week, Britain announced their support for an independent Belgium and began arming Belgian nationalist groups as soldiers landed on the west coast. France and Holland panicked as Prussia stood silently by. France was forced back, spread thin between the forming fronts, all without a single shot being fired. As the situation deteriorated, Prussia proposed a peace conference to be held in Berlin. In the Strasbourg room of the Hotel Bavaria, the great powers agreed on the future of the continent, with France boycotting the conference. Planning to exert their might over Europe, France was prepared for a war before realizing the newfound unity of the opposing powers. In the face of a three-front war, the hegemon of Europe stood down, defeated on paper and outmaneuvered on all sides. The only concession to France was a bizarre one: that the Dutch could make no new colonies without so-called international consensus, negotiated not by the foreign minister but rather a royal advisor and bishop named Talleyrand. It was a negotiation seemingly without pre-approval from Paris, but as the only gain the French had in the treaty, it was accepted regardless. Defeated by their own hubris, the only victor in France was Talleyrand. He used this minor gain as a springboard to what would later be his reorganization of the diplomatic ministry under his close guidance. Back in Berlin, the king was elated. France had proven to be a paper tiger, and with the situation stabilized both at home and abroad, Friedrich set his eyes upon a new goal. Using the trade concessions, the PVH, or Prussian United Trading Corporation, was established. The king sought to both industrialize the country and to use trade to expand its influence globally. To do this, however, he wanted to put into place the first steps of his grand vision. As the concept of the nation and patriotism were slowly being born, the king had his own version in mind. He saw a sort of international system, extended from the Prussian state to form a unified order. Looking out from his palace, he wondered once again about the scope of the world, and knew, above all, he would not allow himself to be limited by it. Uniquely, he saw an unusual amount of potential in the nation of Ikaria. He began an extensive trade relationship, as the two countries gradually aided one another in their mutual industrialization. The king began sending letters to the Alcalde. The Alcalde quickly replied. Nizari was elated to finally have some European recognition, sought above all to firmly assert Ikaria as one of the major powers in the world. The king, in turn, wished to establish a global vision for Prussia, and looked to all the examples of modernism and change to see it done. In the years following the Dutch crisis, Prussia slowly established itself as the eminent power of Central Europe, growing in a way no other European power had. From the gates of Berlin, an image of greatness grew more and more, each success only emboldening the king further. His first concrete step was the establishment of a North Sea bloc, a central base for their power to radiate. Their primary partner was Denmark, whom Prussia had been helping for decades against Sweden, who wished to modernize their navy in a similar manner to Prussia. As talks grew serious and ideas became plans, the king poured every ounce of effort into making sure it succeeded. Hardenberg spent months upon months in Copenhagen as promises of money, trade, and industrial support were guaranteed. Eventually, the PAZ was formed, established an unprecedented political alliance which created a united framework for trade, mobility, and even military affairs. The king considered it the first crowning achievement of his reign, and when news of success reached him, he uncharacteristically threw a lavish party at the palace, speaking before a crowd of attendees that Prussia will be written in the history books forever. We have just made it so. This victory only emboldened the king further, as he began taking a more active role in politics. Sidestepping his elaborate patronage system, the king began pushing far harder than usual on one topic: the admittance of Hanover into the PAZ. Hanover had grown considerably since being freed from Britain, and was the few German industrial centers outside of Prussia. The king began to see it as the final piece of his plan, but many in his cabinet, including Hardenberg, thought it far too provocative and dangerous. The king, however, ignored all concerns and ordered immediate negotiations. The Duke of Hanover was very receptive, and plans were drafted with a shocking speed. It seemed as if it would be smoother than Denmark, but Prussia hadn't done nearly enough due diligence. The admiral offered to use his intelligence service to find out more, but the king refused, believing that a deal was near and any spying would only harm relations. It was a mistake, however, as the king would have known that the situation in Hanover was far more precarious than it appeared. A great part of the population was rightfully worried that Prussia only cared about exploiting their industry, and saw this as a gradual step towards annexation. Many in Hanover didn't believe they'd be treated as an equal partner like the Danish, but rather as a subservient state. In addition, a major reason the Duke was so quick to agree was that he felt threatened by his nephew, who sought power himself and had the support of large parts of the military. The king was unaware of any of this, and marched forward with his plan. Flushed with victory, the king set upon a personal triumph of his, a meeting with the Vive Nizari in Berlin to be held in 6 months' time. The king was elated, and felt as if for the first time in a while, everything was falling into place. The admiral, however, cautioned the king. Though his plans had been successful, there was no telling how long that'd last. While decisiveness was necessary, there was a difference between decisiveness and pride. The king listened, accepting the advice but rejecting it at heart. This would have to succeed, he told himself. He stood in anticipation, excitement hiding anxiety, and anxiety hiding profound dread at the bottom of his soul. I'll meet with the Duke soon. We'll get this all sorted out. The candles were blown out, and the palace lay in darkness cast down from the night. The Prince of Hanover, flanked by soldiers, marches into the royal palace. The Duke is awoken by bangs downstairs. His nephew and General Scharnhorst take control. The Duke slid through a tunnel, a soldier says. Doesn't matter anymore, responds the prince. He grabs the royal courier. Message to the Prussians, negotiations will no longer be necessary. The prince and his staff meet in the war room, turning to Scharnhorst before asking, what do we do if the Prussians attack? Scharnhorst stares at a map before responding, we'll be waiting for them. The king hears the news the next day and summons the high command. The Duke begs for a military intervention, claiming that the people of Hanover are on his side. The king doesn't think this is true, but decides an invasion anyway. Joseph Kraus, now High Admiral, agrees. We're already far too committed to turn back. An action would only embolden our enemies. We must strike fast and strike hard and do it in such a way that Hanover hasn't the opportunity to fight back. An old general speaks up. Hanover will never be able to resist us. If the king wills it, we'll march on the field and destroy them right there. I don't think they'll make it that easy, says the admiral. We need to cut off their head, remove their capacity to fight. Hamburg, their industrial center. I'll block it on sea and you storm it by land. The Lord General grew frustrated at the admiral's interference, but had broadly the same idea. Hanover can't match our total strength. We'll mobilize faster than they can and strike harder. I agree about Hamburg. I'll see that sorted out. The king turned to speak. And what about Scharnhorst? The Lord General nodded. Scharnhorst. His work in Belgium was impressive, but he had British support. I'll bring force no skill can overcome. The propaganda machine began beating the drum of war, to defend the Duke from treason, to secure Prussia's glory. The people went along, but in Hanover a far more powerful effect was felt. The streets were filled with supporters, the national fervor swept the duchy. The new Duke spoke to the crowds. Never shall we allow Hanover to fall. The people cheered with fervor, and every cheer bolstered the ranks of Scharnhorst's rapidly growing army. Europe watched the forces meet in the field. Outnumbered, Hanover was pushed back, but in a victory far more costly to Prussia than to Hanover. The Prussians marched to Hamburg, anxiously resolved for the true battle ahead. The Lord General attacked the city in force, but was pushed back as the scale of Hanover's resistance became clear. Scharnhorst had turned the region into a fortress, the city becoming a bunker and the countryside a hostile war zone. They were attacked on all sides, having to divert a quarter of their forces to secure their supply lines. As the Lord General planned another attack, Scharnhorst surprised the Prussians with an attack of their own. The Lord General was caught off guard but regrouped. He fell back on his backup, that no matter what Hanover had, they didn't have his force. As time went on, the Battle of Hamburg became a siege. The trench was 5 layers deep, fitted with hundreds of artillery raining down on the city. As far from ideal, the Lord General would not be beaten. In the face of the long siege, spontaneous developments began on the field. The Hanover surprise attacks were gradually mimicked by Prussia itself. Commanders adopted irregular tactics, and the fighting grew more and more brutal. It soon became a laboratory of war, each side seeing what advantage they could squeeze as the city was gradually leveled. Scharnhorst continued his attacks, but gradually found them less and less effective. Prussian Corporal Kajan Schuster, a Pomeranian commoner, grew most vicious in fighting back. He led his own detachment of regular forces, chasing Hannish forces through the night, burning down camps and attacking locals who resisted. Promoted to major for his actions, he was tasked in creating a breakthrough. As the siege dragged on further, the city was reduced nearly to rubble. Kajan believed the locals had to see their support for victory to be possible. This infamously resulted in large reprisals, but he was careful not to be indiscriminate. He promised security to those who aided, and began recruiting his own forces with promises he had no authority to make. The Lord General was furious, but the king insisted he be given free rein. The breakthrough eventually came, the defenses collapsed with artillery and the army launching a general assault. The fighting was street to street, with Schuster's forces being the only to adapt well to the style of combat. He attacked from the side and fought a spearhead all the way to the city center. Though the defenders still controlled large parts of the city, it became clear the situation was unwinnable. Realizing the futility, Scharnhorst surrendered to avoid any more destruction. With the army decimated and its greatest general captured, the Duke formally surrendered days later. Prussia was victorious, though the way it was victorious painted an image the king was worried about repeating. Hardenberg said as much to the king. If this is the way we win wars, we must never be in a position to lose one. The city was ruined, and the king felt the Lord General mostly responsible. He took no actions against him, but was interested in Major Schuster. He seemed to understand the sentiment of nationalism, an alternative to the old guard. He was promoted to colonel and granted an audience of the king. It's rare to have such men of merit, so I trust you with using it wisely. Schuster bowed down and replied, I'll use it however you see fit. The Duchy of Hanover was restored, but not for long. It was gradually absorbed into the Prussian state, maintaining its legal titles but not its independence. Hamburg itself would slowly be rebuilt, the canvas for industry in a new Prussia. Factories stood on the old battlegrounds as the trenches were converted into the subterranean passages of the first modern city. In only a few short years, the king had established his rule and drew upon his country an image that Europe had not seen. The outline of modernity was sketched into place as the world watched carefully, wondering what direction it would head. The king sat in his palace, staring out at Berlin beyond, till he was interrupted by a servant. Your Majesty, the Alcott is on his way.